Good morning, class. I want to thank you for coming out for this lecture and for bearing with a video lecture. Uh, I just want to give us an opportunity to hear the book of Daniel and to really understand what is going on in this book. It is important to think about the setting of this book. This book is speaking of the time of the exile, and actually before the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, before the temple was destroyed, there was an earlier group of exiles that was taken into Babylon. We know about this from Ezekiel. And even before that, there was a previous group of exiles. The first time that Babylon attacked Jerusalem, it was a smaller group, but it was some of the wisest young men of the kingdom of Judah, including a man named Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who get renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so this book tells the stories of these four men and their experiences in Babylon, and also relates visions that Daniel has about the future. So now, even though this is discussing things that happened in the 6th century BCE, it is believed by most scholars to have been written in the year 164 BC, and they are able to pinpoint it because of the visions of the future and how they focus on what is going on in the year 164. And so, when we think about this book, we should be thinking about two different settings. The setting of the story, the setting within the text, and also the historical setting of what's going on when the author is writing this book. Now, some of the traditions in this book may go back earlier. It's not to say that the whole thing was composed, just made up in the year 164, but that in the year 164 is when this book is written down in the form that we have it today, and it's written down with the situation of that year in mind. What is significant about that year? If you know anything about the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, it is a remembrance of the time when the family of the Hasmoneans, and specifically Judah Maccabee, they start a revolt against the Greeks, and they are able to purify the temple after it has gone through a period of uncleanness. And so we're going to see what's going on here. The Greeks in those years had told Jews that they could not practice their law, they could not practice their festivals. They were forcing the Jewish people to offer sacrifices to Zeus, sacrifices of pigs, to eat unclean animals, to no longer practice the Sabbath. And so it was a time of forced compromise, and the people had to decide whether to choose death as the consequence for disobedience to the Greeks, or whether they would submit. And so this book is carefully crafted to give the answer to that question. Now, the book is outlined in two major parts. The first 6 chapters give 6 stories about Daniel and his friends, and then the last 6 chapters give 4 visions of Daniel about the future, leading up to the time that this book is written down. We could also see it outlined according to the language. Unlike pretty much all the other books we have seen in the Jewish Bible, this book is written in 2 languages. You have this Aramaic section running from chapters 2 through 7. In other words, the last 5 stories in this book are written in Aramaic, as is the first vision. And these have what's called a chiastic outline, where chapter 2 matches chapter 7, chapter 3 matches chapter 6, chapter 4 matches chapter 5, in the themes that are emerging in these chapters. If you're interested in exploring this more, you can watch the Bible Project video on Daniel. But then there is it written in a different language, in Hebrew, the language that the rest of the Jewish Bible is written in. We have the introduction to this work, and then we have in chapters 8 through 12 more visions that get a little bit more specific about what it's going to look like with the 4th and final kingdom that get mentioned in the visions in chapters 2 and 7. So Some scholars think that the Aramaic section was written previously, and that a later author is coming in and writing these Hebrew parts, but there are different theories about how the book came about in different languages. Now, as a side point, I should mention that this is not the only book that incorporates Aramaic into it. We saw Ezra and Nehemiah that there are official letters to and from the king of Persia. These letters were written in Aramaic, and so when you read Ezra and Nehemiah, it actually switches from being in Hebrew through most of the book to, when it's relating those letters, switching to Aramaic. Aramaic and Hebrew are related languages. They are sister languages, but they are not the same. Aramaic was the lingua franca of the area. It was the language that the Assyrians had spoken and that later cultures adopted as their language as well. Hebrew is the language of the Jewish people. So, our overview, we have seen that this is probably written in the time that the Greeks are causing real hardship for the Jews, and it reflects back on an earlier time of real hardship, the exile into Babylon, and what it was like for these 4 men as they are called to stay faithful to their God in the midst of a different culture that is trying to get them to live in a different way. And so we start with the 6 stories, and first of all, you have these 4 men in the royal court in Babylon. And what we see in chapter 1 is that they refuse to compromise their traditions. Now, this could cause them problems, and so they are told, hey, if the king finds out that you're not eating the royal portions, that you're not partaking of the Babylonian foods, then the king is going to be upset with me because I have let you guys grow weak and you're just eating vegetables and drinking water. And they say, well, test us for 10 days. Watch what will happen. And sure enough, God takes care of them. And so when they're finally presented before the king, even though they haven't eaten the wonderful royal portions of food that were offered to them, they are still stronger and healthier than all the other men of the kingdom. And so we read in chapter 1, verse 19, and please turn there, it's on page 1235. Daniel chapter 1, verses 19 through 20. The king spoke with them, and among them all no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Now, if you fast forward to the year 164 BCE, when the Greeks are forcing the Jewish people to be Greek, they are forcing them to learn Greek philosophy, to partake of Greek customs, to eat of the Greek foods. And this chapter would really speak to people of that day, where they say, hey, let's remember what happened when the first Jews were taken into Babylon and they were forced to eat unclean foods. They refused and they were blessed and they advanced among everyone else in the kingdom. And so it's a call to refuse to compromise in your traditions. The second chapter, which I have an artist's depiction of on the left, is the chapter dealing with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of this statue with the head of gold and the shoulders and arms of silver and the belly and thighs of bronze, and then you have the iron mixed with clay in the feet and toes. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and then he sees this stone that is not cut by human hands that strikes the statue, and it all falls down, and then the stone grows to cover the whole world. And Nebuchadnezzar wants to know, what is this dream? And so he asks his wise men to interpret his dream for him, and they say, okay, will you tell us what you dreamed? And Nebuchadnezzar said, no, if you're really wise and you can interpret dreams, you could tell me what the dream itself was. And they say, oh, nobody could do that. You have to tell us the dream, and then we interpret it. And so Nebuchadnezzar decides that he is going to kill all of the wise men of the land because they can't interpret his dream. And then Daniel has his friends fast and pray, and he goes to sleep and he dreams the same dream that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. And he comes before Nebuchadnezzar the next day, and he tells him exactly what he dreamed. And he says, this is the interpretation of it. You, O Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold, and after you there will be 3 more kingdoms, and then these kingdoms will all be defeated by a kingdom that is not of human origin, and that kingdom is going to fill the whole earth. Fast forward to the 2nd century BCE, when the people have seen the kingdoms of Babylon and Media and Persia and Greece rising up and being powerful, and they think of the strong iron of the Greeks, and yet it's a split kingdom, a divided kingdom ever since the time of Alexander the Great. And they recognize, yes, we've lived through this statue. Now it's time for God to establish his kingdom. And so we see this dream is a dream that foretells the future in a way that's going to be meaningful for the people living in the 2nd century. But we should also notice what happens as Daniel interprets the dream. Turn to Daniel chapter 2, verses 46 to 49. And if you still haven't opened your Bible, please do so. Let's follow along here and see what the text says. So I'm on page 1238, Daniel chapter 2, verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, worshipped Daniel, and commanded that a grain offering and incense be offered to him. The king said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel, gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel remained at the king's court. And so we see Daniel, as he is faithful to God, as he's fasting and praying, God takes care of him, and not only prevents him from being killed with all the wise men of Babylon, but exalts him to this high position in the king's court. Then we move on to chapter 3. And it is notable that where in chapter 2 we had this statue and the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar himself, now in chapter 3, what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He builds a statue. It's all of gold. And he wants all the people to worship this statue. Fast forward to the 2nd century BC, when the people are urged to worship Zeus, the reminder of, hey, we remember a time when the people were told, you need to bow down, you need to worship the king. And what happens? The people refuse to bow down to the statue, and God takes care of them. You know, if you look at chapter 3, verse 6, the people are told, whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. You have to think as the reader, what would I do in this situation? If it's being faced with death or bowing down, would I be willing to bow down just this one time? As we find out, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fail to do so. And if you turn the page to chapter 3, verse 16, you find how they speak to the king. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. This is the model response to the one who calls you to compromise. And what happens? They get thrown into a blazing furnace, but they survive it somehow. And it's miraculous that they survive it, just so you wouldn't think that possibly the furnace wasn't hot enough. The men who throw them into the furnace, they die because of the great heat. And yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stay alive in the furnace, and they are helped by one who has the appearance of a son of the gods, or appearance of a god, right there in the furnace with them. And so Nebuchadnezzar calls them to come out, and when he sees that they have survived, he says this in chapter 3, verse 28. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command. Notice that this is the king saying, they disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. If you are, again, living in the 2nd century and you hear this story, you have the example that even Nebuchadnezzar would come to realize that you should not obey the king that tries to get you to turn away from God. And that really, a wise king, his conclusion is going to be that the God of Israel is the true God. There is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get a further promotion by the king. And so we've seen 3 stories, and in each of the 3 stories, the main characters refuse to compromise, and God takes care of them. Now we come to chapter 4. Here, Nebuchadnezzar has this vision in which it is told that he is going to be driven insane, and he is going to basically act like an animal. He's going to eat the grass for this period of 7 years. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, well, thank you, Daniel, for interpreting this dream for me. That's great to know. And then he still continues in his pride. And when he does so, suddenly this vision comes true. So you have in chapter 4, verse 30, the king is boasting in his pride. Is this not magnificent Babylon, which I have built as a royal capital by my mighty power and for my glorious majesty? Of course, the Jew knows, no, this isn't by your majesty. This isn't by your power. God has given you the ability to do this, and God can take it away. And sure enough, God takes away his sanity, and he goes through this period of not being able to act as a human. And at the end of the time, it says in verse 34 of chapter 4, when that period was over, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored the one who lives forever, for his sovereignty is an everlasting sovereignty, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does what he wills with the host of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can stay his hand or say to him, what are you doing? And so, in verse 37, Nebuchadnezzar concludes, I praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. And once again, this is what enemy kings should do, and it's an encouragement to the people of the 2nd century. Hey, look what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. He was humbled. Now, in the 2nd century, you have Antiochus Epiphanes. He's called Epiphanes because he believes that he is an epiphany. He is a manifestation of God in the flesh. And he boasts of his own greatness, much like Nebuchadnezzar. And this is a reminder that he too is going to be humbled. In the following chapter, you have Nebuchadnezzar's grandson Belshazzar, and we experience his pride. Now, don't get confused. Daniel gets renamed Belteshazzar, a slightly different name than Belshazzar. So two different people. But Belshazzar is the king and the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And he, in his arrogance, decides to have the utensils from the Temple of Jerusalem brought out for his great festival that he is throwing. And he is boasting of his own greatness. And in that moment, he has a vision of a hand writing on a wall these words that Daniel then comes in to interpret for him because he doesn't know what they mean. And Daniel interprets that your kingdom is going to be taken from you, and it's going to be divided among the Medes and the Persians. And you come to verse 29, and Belshazzar says, "Oh, well, what a great wise person you are. Let's have you clothed in purple, a chain of gold put around your neck, and a proclamation made that you should be the third highest official in the kingdom." Not realizing that what Daniel has said is this kingdom's coming to an end. And sure enough, verse 30, that very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And so, right after Belshazzar honors Daniel, he is killed. Just as Nebuchadnezzar had been humbled, Belshazzar is humbled by death through the attack by the Medes and the Persians. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, of course, has his sanity restored. He is someone who praises God in the end. Not so Belshazzar. He recognizes Daniel here, but his ultimate defeat is done. Which brings us to chapter 6. And now we're going to deal with a different king. This is King Darius. This is not a Babylonian king, but this is a Medo-Persian king. And so in chapter 6, what happens is the wise men of the kingdom, they're sick of Daniel. They want to get rid of him. And so they urge the king to come up with this law that people should worship only him. And he agrees. And Daniel refuses to worship. We go back to that theme from the earlier chapters of refusal to compromise. And what happens? God takes care of him. Look at chapter 6, verse 21. Daniel then said to the king, this is after he's been in the lion's den and has been protected, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no wrong." Then the king was exceedingly glad, and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Again, a message for people tempted to compromise in a later generation. Skip down to verse 25. Chapter 6, verse 25 says, "Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language throughout the whole world, 'May you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions.' So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." Now, what kind of literature is this? When we looked at Ezra and Nehemiah, we saw a lot of official documents, and I pointed out there that these actually match what we know of the Persians and what Persian documents would have looked like. We do have the Cyrus cylinder that mentioned where Cyrus actually sends people back to their homelands and urges them to offer sacrifices to their own gods. So Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a lot of historical basis for what we're reading there, and it's possibly written close to the time. It uses first-hand writings by Ezra and Nehemiah that seem to be authentic. The book of Daniel, as we've seen, seems to be written 400 years later. We don't have record of these stories having happened in the time of Babylon and among the Persians. And in fact, there are some times where we'll find here historical errors. Darius the Mede is apparently a reference to the actual Persian king Darius, but not the one who ends up defeating the Babylonians. That was Cyrus. And so there seems to be a little bit of confusion on the part of the author here. It seems that he's telling tales of what might have been back in the days of old. And perhaps this is related on traditions that have been passed down about a character named Daniel. But as far as taking these at face value, it's probably advisable not to do so. This is a series of stories, perhaps a historical fiction or historical fiction based on true stories, based on some historical remembrances. But it's really a story that is meant to be geared for the 2nd century. And so, if you were to, for example, write an exegesis paper on a passage in the book of Daniel, you would want to pay attention to both contexts. The context of the 6th century, when this event is happening, and the context of the 2nd century, when it is being written down, because it is written down in a way that is going to speak to people in that day. If I were today to write a story about something that may have happened hundreds of years ago, and I were to write it in a way that it's going to speak to the political environment of the 21st century in America, I would hope that people would pay attention to how it's going to be heard in the 21st century in America. Maybe if you pick it up a couple thousand years later and you try to read it, you're going to be tempted to read it in light of the setting that I put it in, and rightly so. I'm picking that setting, 6th century BCE in this case, for a reason. But also be aware of how my own contemporary experience is affecting the way that I tell the stories. And so we have these 6 stories told for a reason. This is a message to the people dealing with temptation to compromise to the Greeks. A reminder that you need to stay faithful to God and to your traditions, and God will take care of you. But that's not the end of the book of Daniel. We have 4 visions. Now, on the left here, you see this statue that Nebuchadnezzar had envisioned. Daniel is also going to have a 4-part vision, but instead of 4 parts of a statue, it is 4 beasts. And we're told here that these 4 beasts represent 4 kingdoms. Apparently, it is the kingdoms of Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. Some would say it's Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and clearly, when you get into the Roman era, which is the time of Jesus, not only Christians but also Jews of that time read Rome as the 4th beast. And 4 centuries later, Jews will continue to read Rome as the 4th beast. But it appears in the 2nd century origins of this book that the author wanted us to see that 4th kingdom as Greece. The 4th beast has 10 horns. They represent 10 kings. And the last 3 of these are replaced by the most arrogant horn of all, this growing horn that represents Antiochus. Antiochus he did replace his brother and his brother's 2 sons. And so these 3 horns are replaced by the one. And Antiochus, he is the one who decides, we're going to really assimilate the Jewish people into Greek culture. We are going to force them to stop circumcising their children, to stop keeping the Sabbath. We're going to force them to eat the foods that we eat, to worship the gods that we worship. And so this this individual, Antiochus, one of the worst tyrants in Jewish history, is depicted as this horn. And as this is happening, the divine council is meeting up in heaven, and they make a decision to put this fourth beast to death. But before they do, it says that the laws and the festivals are changed for a time, times, and half a time. This would seem to represent the numbers 1, 2, and half. You add those together, you get 3.5 years. Sure enough, it is for 3.5 years that the temple is defiled, that people aren't able to offer the sacrifices. They aren't able to celebrate the festivals of Jerusalem because Antiochus has defiled the temple. He has erected a statue to Zeus, and he has started to sacrifice, have pigs sacrificed on the altar there. And so everything is now defiled, it is unclean, and offerings to God are not happening for this 3.5 years. But at the end of the period, this fourth beast is put to death. And then we read about one like a human being, according to NRSV. Literally, that would be one like a son of man. This expression, son of man, just means someone who's descended from humans. It probably is meant to contrast these beasts. And so you have sons of other kinds of animals, but then you have one like a son of man. And this one like the son of man is related to the holy ones of the Most High. So if we look at verse 18 in chapter 7, it says, "But the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever." Or in verse 22, "Until the Ancient One came, then judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High, and a time arrived when the holy ones gained possession of the kingdom." Or verse 27, "The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High." And so here is what the divine council is deciding. It sees this one like a son of man come riding on the clouds before the Ancient of Days, come riding into the divine council, and says, yes, you can now have the kingdom. It is this rock not cut out by human hands, to refer back to language from chapter 2, that strikes down everything else and is replaced. Now this verse is especially important for Christianity because in the New Testament, Jesus apparently sees himself as the Son of Man. And so when he is on trial and he's before the high priest, he says to the high priest that you will see the Son of Man riding on the clouds and seated at the right hand of God in heaven. And so what Jesus is saying is Daniel 7 is ultimately fulfilled in him. After he dies, he goes riding on the clouds to the Father, and the kingdom is given to him. Sometimes this image of Jesus riding on the clouds is seen as this idea that Jesus is going to return from heaven, and that has a parallel in Acts chapter 1, where after Jesus dies and is resurrected, he ascends into heaven, and an angel tells the disciples, just as you saw him go up, you will see him return. So there is this idea of Jesus returning on the clouds, but it appears in the way that the Gospels are written, that the idea here is Jesus is riding on the clouds to the Father to receive the kingdom, and that even is associated in Matthew, Mark, and Luke with the destruction of Jerusalem, where you had these Jewish people who were in charge, but they were merely pawns of the Roman Empire, and they are now destroyed by the Romans. The temple is destroyed in the year 70 CE, And now you have a new situation with Christianity where you don't have a religion centered in Jerusalem with particular people ruling over it, but you have a kingdom that is spread throughout the earth with Jesus ruling on it, ruling over it from heaven. And so this is how the early church envisions this being fulfilled. It's such an important text that I want to spend a moment to think about it. If the fourth beast is Greece, and this is happening right after this times, and half a time, this 3.5 years, then the idea is that the kingdom is taken from the Greeks and given to the people of Israel in the year 164 BCE, which is basically what happens. This Maccabean revolt, Judah Maccabee is able to fight the Greeks and wins a measure of peace for them. Now they're still under Greek domination, but they're able to do their sacrifices again, and eventually the family of Judah Maccabee is able to establish a dynasty that is a sovereign nation itself and establish independence from the Greeks. This may be what is envisioned originally in the book, but as I said, over time, especially as the Romans rise up and the Romans take away the independence of Judea in the year 63 BCE, now Rome is viewed as the fourth beast. And this imagery is reinterpreted and reapplied to a new situation. For Christians, Jesus is that Son of Man who received the kingdom, and that's why everything changed in the year 70. That's why the temple was destroyed. That's why it has never been rebuilt, because now there is a new one who is ruling. It's the one who rides on the clouds. It's Jesus himself, the ultimate Son of Man. For Jews, for centuries, Rome was continued to be the fourth beast, and Jews awaited a Messiah to come and deliver them over Rome. Eventually, Rome falls, and yet the Jewish people never really reestablished their independence. They, until the last century, were not able to really establish themselves as a nation in the land of Israel. And now that has happened, but there's still efforts to reinterpret, reapply Daniel chapter 7 in Jewish tradition, with Christian tradition seeing this ultimately is about Jesus, and with many scholars saying, hey, let's just focus on what did the 2nd century author mean by it. For those of you who take the Bible as scripture and want to ask a deeper question, what did God mean by this? You may take comfort in recognizing how God inspired a 2nd century human author to write a story and to have Daniel envision the future in such a way that is going to speak to and encourage his own audience, and has served as an encouragement for audiences beyond that 2nd century setting, as they have reinterpreted and reapplied it in their own situations. It is, as the Bible Project on video on Daniel says, it is a pattern and a promise. There is a pattern of beasts rising up against God's kingdom, and there is a promise that God is going to ultimately defeat the final beast. In fact, for Christians who look to the book of Revelation, some of this imagery is reapplied by John still, as he is trying to envision how is this going to unfold in Roman history after the coming of Christ. And interpreters today still look back to this text and say, okay, we see this pattern, we see this promise, now how is it going to be unfolded in reality? So the first of the 4 visions is Daniel's dream of the 4 beasts. The second one, Daniel dreams about 2 beasts, the first one representing the Medes and the Persians, and then the second one representing the Greeks, and specifically Alexander the Great is envisioned here, and his defeating of the Medes and Persians. But then we move to chapter 9, and we get something that's different than the other chapters. This is a prayer of Daniel. And Daniel is said to be recalling Jeremiah's prophecy that Judah would serve Babylon for 70 years. And he prays and he says, okay, now that we're in the first year of Darius, now that we've gotten past these 70 years, the Babylonians have been judged. Now, God, will you bless Jerusalem? And the answer that he gets from the angel Gabriel is, the people have been so unfaithful. It's not just going to be 70 years, but it's going to be 77s. And so you have this idea, it's really the word for weeks, 70 weeks, but he doesn't mean 497 day periods. What he means is 77 day periods. What he means is 77 year periods. He's extending the vision out. And so for this period of 490 years, Jerusalem is going to have trouble. Now, how do these numbers work out? It probably is not wise to get it to work out with precision, because it's a little bit difficult to get the 490 years to map onto anything, though some have found a way to make it line up exactly with Jesus by saying that the beginning decree is the decree that is made in the time of Nehemiah, but that argument may be a little bit forced. Instead, the idea is that there's going to be an extended period of things not being right for Jerusalem before the final prophecies of the future glories of Jerusalem are fulfilled. And so then we have this statement of there's going to be 7 sevens and then 62 sevens, and then the anointed one shall be cut off. Now this is probably, in the author's mind, a reference to Onias the priest, who is an anointed priest, but he is murdered during the time of Antiochus. And then there's a reference to, for half a week offerings will cease. As we already pointed out, for 3.5 years, a time, times and half a time, offerings ceased in the temple from the year 168 to 164 BCE. And so this seems again to be references to these things. But then after this, God is going to establish his kingdom. Daniel has a final vision in chapters 10 through 12. And in this section, Daniel gets details of the history of Persia and Greece all the way down to the time of Antiochus. Now, most scholars say, remember, this is being written in the time of Antiochus. It's probably history that is put in the terms of predictive prophecy in order to comfort and encourage the people. And you get to the last 6 verses of chapter 11, and it affirms that Antiochus is going to come to an end. He is going to be defeated as he tries to oppose God in his temple. The discussion of Antiochus's end is actually not how historians have understood Antiochus to have actually died. And so it's often believed that this was actually written right about this time. And the author is looking back, he's telling the history of Persia and Greece, and then he looks forward and he envisions what could it be like the end for Antiochus, and gives this word of comfort to the people in verses 40 to 45, as if these are the words that Daniel had received hundreds of years ago. Daniel saw all of this. And then afterward, chapter 12, verse 1, and if you could turn there. Chapter 12, verse 1. At that time Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish, such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, every one who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, keep the word secret, and the book sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be running back and forth, and evil shall increase. And so this final vision is a vision that even the dead, those who sleep in the dust of the earth, shall arise. That there's going to be a change in all things. Death is going to be overcome, and people are going to experience either everlasting life or everlasting contempt. The whole order of history is going to be changed, and God is going to establish his final kingdom. The last 9 verses of the book involve Daniel saying, well, okay, when exactly is this going to happen? And there are a couple different numbers given, 1,290 days and 1,335 days. It's not clear exactly what this means, although both those numbers are close to 3.5 years. And so are these speculations of exactly how many days it's going to be until Antiochus falls and God establishes his everlasting kingdom? It's a little hard to say what to do with these numbers. But we can see here clearly in all of these visions that Daniel has that he is looking forward to this time in the 2nd century when Antiochus causes so much problems for the people. More so, perhaps, than Nebuchadnezzar had caused for Daniel and his friends. And we have this reminder that Daniel has seen all this. It's bound to happen. And in the end, God is going to be victorious. So in conclusion, we have 6 stories in the book of Daniel that speak this message: refuse to compromise, and God will take care of you. Now, of course, we can remember here chapter 3, verse 18, where they said, even if he doesn't deliver us from the furnace, we will not worship your gods or bow down to the statue you have set up. So even if God isn't going to take care of you, still refuse to compromise. But refuse to compromise, that is a key message of the book of Daniel. Second, the kingdom of God will replace the kingdoms of men. These beasts or this statue, they're going to fall. They're going to be replaced by what God is doing. And then we have the visions that remind us that all of history is in God's hands. That the kingdoms of the world are like beasts who will be overcome by one like a son of man. And these calculations, we are nearing the glorious future for God's people. And so this is the book of Daniel. A wonderful book, beautiful stories, often told to children today because the stories are such comforting, encouraging stories of God's care for his people and calls to be faithful. And so down to this day, people look to these stories as reminders to be faithful to God. And that is the book of Daniel. If you have any questions about Daniel, I encourage you to send me an email. I will either respond to the email or maybe next time we meet, I'll start class by addressing the questions. But if you don't send me an email about the questions, you'll probably forget that you had them when we come back all together after Thanksgiving. So I encourage you to send me any questions you have about the book of Daniel. And also, I encourage you to be in contact with me if you have any questions about the exegesis paper. You'll find instructions for the exegesis paper on Canvas, and it gives details about how many pages to devote to different parts of the paper. Be sure to look for commentaries in the library on your particular passage. You might find, for example, a commentary on the book of Daniel. And again, read through the introduction of the commentary, which is going to talk about when was this written, what's going on. It's going to help you with the context section of your paper. And then go to the specific passage, and you'll find that the commentary will go verse by verse and say, hey, verse 1 is talking about this, verses 2 and 3 are talking about that. Try to outline your passage. Be able to figure out what is the flow of the passage, like we did with Job 28, or like our guest speaker did last week with Lamentations chapter 2. I encourage you to really get the flow of the passage, and then as you write about the message of the passage, just do what the commentaries do. Go verse by verse and explain it. And so you're doing a running commentary on the text. And then finally, once you've got that all together, boil it down to here is the main point that this is trying to make. For example, refuse to compromise and God will take care of you, maybe the main point. Or something along those lines. And then talk about application. How can that be important to someone today? Maybe you could think of situations today where, for example, someone is faced with temptations to compromise in today's political environment, and that this passage could be a reminder of God's care and of the need to stay faithful to God. A reminder that God holds history in His hands, and that even if things aren't going your way right now, that they will if you are on God's side. Those are just examples of the kinds of main message and application you might find in a passage if you're doing the book of Daniel. But you can do any book of the Jewish Bible. Go ahead and look into the Psalms or one of the prophets or some of the wisdom literature or look at the Torah, look at a law, look at history, look at something in the Deuteronomistic history. Pick a passage that really strikes you, that's interesting, that you want to study deeper, and then unpack it for us. When we come back, we will have that moment for you to have 10 minutes just going over your passage with people in the class, and I will give you feedback at that point. Other people in the class hopefully can give you feedback, things that they're seeing in the passage, and then your exegesis paper will be due that Friday. I think it's December the 1st. So I look forward to coming back and working with you all on these exegesis papers. And in the meantime, have a good time doing research. Have all your research done before you leave for Thanksgiving break, if you can. And also have a great Thanksgiving. I will see you later.